Jason a SANS certified instructor and a Dragos employee, so he's got a foot in both, and he's been in this position throughout his career, where he's been working for FERC, working for Department of Energy, working with asset owners and operators. So he's kind of in all parts, helping create challenging issues for utilities and then helping solve them with utilities. And has an entire history of that, and really just been kind of an absolute kind of involved in every part of what asset owners and operators have to deal with, face challenges, making the systems better every step of the way. This presentation really kind of looking at that risk management approach, and I'm really anxious to kind of hear all the wisdom that's going to be poured out on us. So Jason, take over.
Awesome. Thank you for that really kind introduction. And as soon as I see slides and get mouse control, I'll move forward. But I will say that a lot of what you're about to see is, and this is where it's probably the nerve-wracking part for me, is like, this is like months of work talking through what asset owners are doing and seeing even the presentations that you've already had so far, right? So I'm going to tie some threads between what has already taken place from Michael Hoffman's presentation on crown jewels analysis, also things that you would have seen overnight for those of you in the Americas during the day, during your other sessions. Peter Jackson's presentation, really solid if you haven't seen that yet, on the safety conversation, as well as Johannes did a great one on risk that I'm going to pull forward some of the topics with. So I don't know if there's the buttons for me to have control. At least I don't see them. Ah, there they go. They work. Okay, I won't spend time on my slides about who I am because there's a lot of great content that I want to get to, but I will say that this comes from, again, a sort of background of not only what we've seen in the federal government side, so some of the conversations that even Ann had about how sector-specific agencies, which is where I worked at the U.S. Department of Energy, look at risk, but then also what do we do as asset owners? How do we have this conversation about what it is that we should be investing in is sort of a key critical component of this. Buttons work, buttons do work. If we go through this and you're still shaking your head or you're scratching it, you're saying, I don't know where to start, don't worry. There's actually some already sort of pre-baked material we did at Disc SANS way back in the month of May of 2020, which feels like both a year ago, but also like 10 years ago. And if you want to go through and look at the ICS Security Crucible, that's a presentation that you see on the YouTube video there. That's the URL. It's going to give you really this idea of a starting point for any ICS program, regardless of your size, regardless of your sector. And it'll also do it based off of a maturity model, meaning that's a crawl, walk, run approach. So no matter where you are, you'll be able to really figure out how you want to grow. And we used medieval weapons to describe them. So that's kind of cool, right? And I use that sort of conversation about medieval weaponry to talk about what we're going to discuss today as armor. I won't be using armor shields and all that stuff, but I will be using sort of that idea of how do we protect what it is that we're discussing and sort of building it into something we want to do with our financial officers, our safety officers, that executive suite that sometimes doesn't always have the right conversation about security. We're going to fix that today. But it means I need to start off with sort of like these esoteric questions, the sort of the existential crisis of, well, what is security when we think about this versus what is risk? Security, which is where we find ourselves living our day-to-day, is really the state of what is, right? What is our program? What are the controls we have in place? Whereas risk, which is where our executives like to sit, talks about the potential of harm to the organization. The potential of harm and the state of what is aren't always the same thing, right? And as a matter of fact, the way that we measure that and talk about it are going to be very different for those organizations. And no better way to highlight that than walk through a tale of two industrial executives as they prepare for their quarterly board meeting. Let's just pretend it's quarterly. And we're going to invite the CISO for one of these conversations. So they're going to this board meeting, which is a bunch of other folks who are going to describe either the health of the organization, whether it be a company or a municipality. They're going to talk through what it is that you're going to be planning for the next maybe quarter, year, 3 years, 5 years. And they want to have a discussion with both the financial officer and the CISO. Financial officer gets up, cracks knuckles. How's everybody doing? They start off with a conversation about, well, what are the risks and the countermeasures to those risks that we have on a financial level for the organization. They may have also a conversation about what is our risk appetite. Well, for our strategic risks, we're actually going to be a little bit open, maybe even borderline hungry on our risk appetite. But when it comes to legal and compliance, we want to make sure those things are locked down. That's going to be very averse for our appetite on what things we'll accept from a risk perspective. And they may even have this conversation about, well, where are the actual margins based off dollar values for those risks with some sort of forecasting or modeling into the future. They're coming in with almost Dow Jones industrial-like charts and graphs to be able to describe what their risk is and how it is that the organization should respond to those risks. Very good presentation, by the way. And then all of a sudden you have the CISO. And I have an asterisk next to CISO because who knows, right? CISOs in a lot of organizations may not be quote unquote true executives. They could be a director or a manager reporting to maybe a CIO or reporting to an operational silo somewhere else. And they're being brought in to be able to talk to the managers and the directors and the board for this one quarterly briefing. Okay, sweating a little bullets here. What are we going to talk about? Code red, everything is messed up. There are 50,000 attacks on our firewall per day. Just this year alone, there are almost 18,000 vulnerabilities. And did you just read that last report? There's like a 30% increase in threats. I can't do this job. This is way too much stuff. And obviously, that's not a great conversation to have. And to some of my CISO friends who don't do this, I know that you're in the more mature category. But having briefed as many boards as I have, it's not surprising to see what CISOs will put in front of their board to be able to say, I need more budget. I need more resources. And the conversation here, though, unfortunately, leads to chaos. It leads to a reactionary, a knee jerk of, well, I've already given you this budget. What more do you want? How more can you expand this team so that it's not code red? Can we at least get to code yellow? I mean, code green may not be possible, but where are the things that I need to give you as a board member so you can be successful? Well, when a board sees this conversation, they immediately think that the risk does not equal the risk, meaning that the financial officer's risk, the way that they're describing the problem, does nowhere near the maturity of what it is that they're thinking about on the security side. Because those metrics that we showed were security metrics. There may be things that we'd use to describe our program, and let's never mind like 50,000 attacks on a firewall per day is probably the worst metric you could present to anybody. But there's this conversation about, well, what is meaningful for our security program may not be meaningful for risk, for that potential of harm. So how do we have a better conversation for that CISO? And again, I know that there are mature CISOs out there that don't have this conversation, but the vast majority of security leaders that present to the board, unfortunately, need to learn this problem the hard way. And if they go through and try to figure out, well, what are the pieces I need? They're pulling in frameworks or guidelines, maybe if they're lucky, and they are really obtuse, large documents, thousands of pages in some cases that are walking through requirement-like language of what it is you should be presenting or how it is that you should be measuring this thing. And that's not going to be useful, especially if you're starting to scale, or these are the first type of conversations you're having with executives. I think there's one thing that was really cool about the CISO panel that we had yesterday was even the conversation about this potential and the things that they were tracking and the things that keep them up at night aren't necessarily the same things that the security team down in the trenches is looking at, right? Because we may be looking in a myopic view. And so if you're a manager that went from that very small, what's my vulnerability management plan to what are my risks, that becomes a larger conversation that you do need to gain some maturity around. So I am pleased to announce as of today, if you actually go to this link right here, dragos.com/OT cyber risk, it's also in the Slack channel too. We've actually distilled those thousands of pages of frameworks and guidelines and standards for ICS in particular, and framed it as a way that you could actually have some armor. Augmented risk management for operational resilience. Meaning that we actually augment existing practices in risk management. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so where we can, we took all those good knowledge and best practices from IT, but also from finance, also from safety, and made it so that we could actually make it for risk to equal risk when we talk about it with the board. So it is OT specific cyber risk guidance. I'm going to walk through the process momentarily. It's going to be based off engineering. It's going to have some of the things you'd expect to see if you're in a plant environment where you have PHAs. Great, let's use that. Are you a utility and you have business impact analyses? I will use those too. Wherever you have sort of that modeling and engineering expertise, it should be ingested into our cyber risk sort of perspective of the world. If you're new to risk, don't worry. This will walk you through how to create a risk management program for you based off of the size. Even if you're a team of one, you should be able to crawl, walk, run into this in a way that allows you to grow. If you are a risk veteran, don't worry about that either. We're going to talk about the things that you may already be very experienced with and be able to apply that to industrial side, because the risk management conversation is not just owned by the OT security team. It's owned by several leaders across the organization. And there is a maturity model included. People who know me and know my roles in industry, I'm a maturity model geek, and I absolutely needed to be able to make sure that anybody could crawl, walk, run. You're not going to run from the start. You may be walking, maybe with a limp, I don't know. But we want to make sure that you can mature as you grow to address this problem. And it makes sense to link this back to things that we already have within the other confines of the organization, in particular, business continuity and disaster recovery. Because there is this sort of relationship back and forth. This is actually a great sort of concept from NISA documents where they went through and looked at everything that is applicable for business continuity and said, well, what can we do for cybersecurity? How can we make sure that the industrial side is also covered in that? Because they're not different. We shouldn't treat them differently, except in the cases where we need to focus more on those digital parts than maybe natural disasters. So what does that mean? What does that look like? Why would we start with business continuity and disaster recovery? Well, if you think about the assets, those are the same, addressed across both, right? The protection requirements and the control language may be a little bit different, but where we already have PHAs, where we have safety discussions, where we have LOPAs, all of those can be great to sort of say, well, what can we do with a cyber perspective around those? And I know that there are members of the audience who are probably already going to start putting things into Slack about how it is that you do this. There's a lot of great guidance that you're going to see in this document, referencing other external sources like ISA, for example. They also, across business continuity and cybersecurity, have shared goals. It's just that the sort of skill set is going to be different. I don't know many people who do both disaster recovery and security. So the skill sets are going to be different, but the goals that they have at the end of the day are going to be very similar. For example, there may be things that we could do from installing passive safety systems that could both help what is done in business impact analyses, as well as what could be a cybersecurity incident. So let's redefine cybersecurity, cyber risk as a definition of that. If you look through this, we start off with this traditional model for the IT-centric security piece. In disaster recovery, though, they actually have things that are linked very similar to consequence, to threats. But they have this unique thing when they talk about vulnerabilities, that is the capacity to respond. If there were to be an earthquake or a hurricane that is about to face your plant, there's a natural capacity you have to respond when addressing those. And so we just sort of took this, and we're not the first ones to do this, take this idea and say, well, what are the things that we can do to make sure that we have resilience baked into our conversations of threats and vulnerabilities? And if I were to dive into that a little bit deeper, you've already heard a lot about sort of what it is that we do from the Drago side and from the SANS discussions with threats, how it is that we monitor them, how we understand their capabilities. Vulnerabilities is just a screen grab from CISA ICS Cert Alerts. So we already know sort of those vulnerability conversations in our space. And that resilience is what we already do for operations, right? So understanding the resilience of our systems is going to be critical to understanding industrial cyber risk, because we have a natural capacity to respond via physics, via the engineering of the system, via operations. We have resilience there, which brings in the big question of, well, what is then the consequence? Not only could we have to redefine sort of the industrial cyber risk equation, but we also needed to have a little bit of a conversation as to what is the process that would be used as part of this framework. We started off with the ISO 31000 series. Now, for those risk geeks, this looks very familiar, right? This is the same framework that's used for legal risk, for financial risk, for safety risk. If you do risk management, you've done something with this standard. We've even adapted it in cybersecurity context for the IT-centric side in the ISO 27000 series. Well, kind of. I think it's actually, this is like a turtle nerdy side. So this is what the drafting team did. And it's great work. I know how the drafting team got here, but it's still kind of funny because if you look at sort of understanding how this diagram works, what are the big things that change? Well, we do a risk assessment. And then in cybersecurity, we ask you, are you really sure about that? Is that a good enough risk assessment? No, then go and repeat this whole thing all over again. Then we ask it again after we treat the risk. Are you sure you treated that risk appropriately? If not, go back and do it all over again. It's kind of weird. Like compared to safety risk, we don't have that same decision tree, but we do for cybersecurity. It's like a gut check of, are you sure about this? No wonder so many CISOs are nervous about their job when our own risk matrices make us question what it is that we do. But we did ask, could we ICSify this? Could we make this something that was unique for ICS based off the equation we just presented that makes it more meaningful for asset owners and operators? The answer was yes. So I'll walk through this process. This will be sort of the bulk of the conversation in the white paper, how you walk through and frame the conversation before we even get to risk treatment. Because risk treatment is where most of us spend the day-to-day, right? Vulnerability management, segmentation, the controls. But everything above risk treatment is how it is you're supposed to prioritize and get there. So let's just spend a little bit of time talking through what it is that you would do to understand that from the perspective of, I need to know risk. You start off with risk characterization. Now, this is where we understand our critical assets. This is where ingesting things like PHAs, like business impact analyses, things that may not be traditionally viewed as cybersecurity, we ingest that and say, well, what would be an incident that could possibly leverage these things? And it's just really framing at this point. We're not getting into heavy duty risk conversations. We're just trying to understand our systems just a little bit better. Now, a lot of the cool stuff will happen with threat evaluations. Threat evaluations is where we start looking at what the capabilities are of threat adversaries. Where you start driving through a scenario maybe or two. You start trying to figure out, well, the capabilities that are out there, are they focusing on us as an organization, as a sector, geographically? Where are these threats coming in from that I need to evaluate so I can understand the art of what is possible based off of real things that are taking place in industry? Now, one of the things that we actually drew from this, and this is actually great from a SANS white paper perspective about threat profiles. We ingested that, and here's an example template that we have in the paper for Xenotime. You've heard about Xenotime throughout the past couple of days. I don't need to sort of go through Trisis and the conversation there. But what's interesting here about having a threat profile is you can now then, again, give context to what the risks are based off the capacities and the capabilities that we see out there from a threat activity group perspective. You start bringing that in to, again, contextualize the risk that you're about to assess to allow you to understand sort of that idea of what is possible a little bit more. And then we say, okay, well, what does a really bad day look like? Mike Hoffman did a great conversation here about crown jewels analysis. There's also a really good conversation about bow ties earlier in the nighttime sessions that you can use either of those approaches to sort of understand, well, what could happen during a scenario from a threat adversary that we just evaluated with the sort of critical assets that we're examining. The interesting thing here is that you want to come up with objective criteria. So even though there's sort of this qualitative idea of what's very low versus very high, if you look at this chart, there are 5 things that within industrial confines we can talk about for an impact to our events. This comes from other standards from API, from ISA, from others, where we can examine, well, what's the environmental impact? That's something that a bank doesn't worry about, right? That's something that's unique to us as industrials. Also very unique to us, what's the national impact? What are the things that may happen to the military industrial complex, that may happen to a town, that may happen to a whole state if we're not operational? And so you can start looking at this beyond just dollars and cents, but to actually understand what the impacts could be. I don't know a single plant operator out there who can't tell you, well, my boss knows the value of the plant shutdown for a day, and be able to multiply that out based off of what it is an impact could look like for that really bad day that we've been examining. And then rubber starts meeting the road, the risk evaluation piece. This is the thing actually we built so that you could sort of flow all the way down. Because if you talk to anybody who's really nerdy on risk, a lot of people want to get to quantitative risk analysis. They want to get to like the numbers of what that risk is. You tell me the impact is $70 million. Well, what's the probability associated with that? What's my annual loss expectancy? All these really nerdy, great risky things that can happen can't happen first. You need to start off with a very simple architecture review. Every site should have a very simple, these are the best practices we expect you to have. And you're doing a gap analysis. Are we there yet? Before you even say, okay, here's my qualitative risk analysis, the heat map idea. Long live heat maps. Heat maps are dead, but they're always going to be there. How do we have a conversation about where these impacts could possibly be on that qualitative level before we can get to the more granular, what is the quantitative risk analysis? And we make suggestions along the way as to when it is you should be doing each one of these, so you're not lost as to where it is you should start or where it is you should end on this process. With an example of a heat map. So I liked seeing what Johannes did in the EMEA sections about heat maps. This is just going to be a little bit of expansion. And what I mean by that is you can see here, well, if threat motivation capabilities are increasing and my impacts are increasing, then I'm in the red zone, right? And sort of the delineation between those. But our risk equation just isn't about threats. It's not just about vulnerabilities. It's about our resilience. It's about what is it we do as operations and engineering that makes sure that the physics of the process is secure. And so the more resilience we can add, the more we can find ourselves into that blue-green zone than we would be in sort of those worst off areas of the reds. This works with bow ties. This works with CCE conversations that Andy would have had, where you could take this sort of output and use it in a more granular process in a future state once you're mature, once you're able to get through those next steps. And then lastly, where we all find ourselves, risk treatment, right? This is our day-to-day. This is where we live. The thing that's interesting about where we live, though, is that we hardly prioritize it beforehand based off those previous steps. Everything becomes a priority, right? How many times have you seen a new newspaper headline come out and all of a sudden you have to do something with that, even though it may be lower on that risk scale compared to everything else that you're evaluating based off threats, based off the impacts that could happen to your organization. This allows you to contextualize that and gives you a little bit of a buffer between what is it you have to reactively do when dealing with risk management. The other thing that's weird about this, while we all live in this in the day-to-day, we all mostly live in the mitigation category. So if I blow up this idea of what is in risk treatment, there are 5 options here. Control would be mitigation, that last one. Let's say that your plant is sort of contingent upon a large refrigeration unit. Well, because of COVID, maybe you need to put in remote access. So I have a large refrigeration unit that needs remote access. So I could avoid that risk. Sorry, boss, we are not doing that. We can defer that risk. We can do that, but I need to get a better solution and understand what this remote access piece looks like. So why don't we plan for that in the future? We can transfer that risk. I totally loved your idea about having a new secure management thing for remote access. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to get another insurance policy that will cover any sort of cyber damages from a physical event that could happen to my refrigeration unit. Okay, cool. We'll do that. Much better than the accept the risk. I liked your proposal. Totally not going to do it. We're just going to accept that risk because it'll never happen to us. Lastly, that control, that mitigation, you're going to do it and you're not going to defer. You're going to do it right then and there. Those 5 options, we hardly ever explore. We normally only explore the mitigation. We have a hammer and we're just constantly whacking. What we also don't understand is that no matter what we do, there will always be risk. Risk will never be 0. So the idea of residual risk will happen no matter what it is that you do. It'll always exist. And being able to talk to that, to a board especially, for them to understand that you'll never get this thing down to 0 is truly important when we talk about risk management. So what are the columns on the side? Because that's the process. That buffer to get to risk treatment, that context allows us to be able to prioritize things we never did before. But how are we actually monitoring those things? This is not sort of a one and done where we go through a cycle, we're good with risk, I'll see you next year during the next time we have to do this thing. There's going to be this constant conversation about what it is you do to monitor those risks. And the way that we actually suggest that, and you're going to see it in this guidance document, is through a risk register. Now, a risk register may already exist in your enterprise risk management thing, but the problem is it'll probably say like cyber in like one line, and it'll like have like I don't know, maybe not even a dollar value. It'll just say that's Bob's or Alice's problem. So a risk register for us, the thing that we've built out of this was taking those 5 categories from the cyber impacts and actually placing them right there, right in front of you. So you can sort of see what's the financial impact due to this risk? What's the environmental impact? What could be the national level impact if there were to be this type of event? Who owns the risk? And the thing I really love, cost benefit analysis. Dear Mr. CEO, dear board, this is a $70 million risk, but our cost benefit analysis, if you spend $350,000, we can mitigate that. We can actually control that risk better than we were able to before. That by itself is already going to put you light years ahead of whatever it is you may be presenting today. So when you look at a risk register, it's supposed to be this one-stop shop for high-level risk discussions. This is not something that the boots on the ground are going to be using on the day-to-day. It's a management tool and it's a tracking tool. It is not static though. It's something that you'll always have to improve upon, and is absolutely not magic. Just by having a risk register does not mean you magically have managed your risks. You actually have to do something with it, which is probably one of the larger lessons learned I've seen with people who have risk registers. Oh, we have it. When was the last time you used it? Aha, during that board meeting when people want to see things, we update things really, really quickly. If you're not using it, you're not going to get the value out of being able to track these things and get it to that executive discussion that I know so many OT professionals want. And the last piece here, risk communication. How are you actually communicating that monitoring aspect of things? How do you know that risk is equal to risk is equal to risk? Well, you would know that by having a common lexicon. We actually provide a couple examples from industry, from Software Engineering Institute, from Cambridge University, where we talk through how do you have that language of risk so that you are speaking the same conversation as the safety folks, as the financial folks. We constantly say that security is safety. Well, if we're not speaking the same language, then it's not. So you need to adopt the language of others. It's not up to them to meet us where we are. We're the experts. We have to meet them where they are. And so part of that is adopting their language and having a governance strategy. Now, this is borrowed from COVID, a conversation about what should actually be on your team, from the idea of OT security and IT security being in an industrial cyber risk management committee that has links to the board and executives. But you also have other players in there. We've talked about third-party and supply chain risk. Procurement needs to be there. Human resources, is somebody clicking on the bad links? How are we going to deal with any insider threats? They need to be part of that as well. To build a committee then that reviews things in the risk register and at the end of the day has that conversation about what is risky for our organization. And lastly, sort of this idea that they need to all flow from the very top to the very bottom. Everybody needs to understand what's going on with risk. Again, it's not just the security program, what it is we do in day to day, but what is the potential harm that we're trying to prevent. So let's go back to the boardroom. Now that we have a risk management program in 30 minutes or less, we go back to the boardroom as that CISO. They're able to, before the board conversation starts, present on the risk register, give them that risk register, give them something that's in sort of this numerical value of the impacts, who owns the risk and what we're doing about it. You now have a conversation about resilience that's looped into your risk discussions. You have impact criteria that are objective, that are based off engineering impacts that will happen to your organization. And you have the latest conversation about threats. It's no longer a conversation about code red. You now actually have something that's manageable. And because of that, obviously, chaos does not ensue. As a matter of fact, they're handing you giant coins, human-sized coins, to say, just fix this. You did your job. You allowed me to actually understand what the problem was. And then they can have a better conversation about funding that. So again, that's a lot for 20 minutes. I like what Tim says. We're taking like the SANS sort of class mentality, the fire hose, and putting it into these talks. There's a lot more conversations here. So dragos.com/OT cyber risk. That's where you could pick up this entire documentation. Again, thousands of pages of frameworks distilled into like 30-ish pages. So you can sort of work through this as you want. Also, the year in review report. I know we've talked about that already, but that will give you that latest conversation about the trends that would be valuable for this process. And I would say that would be the end of my talk. But I promise folks, if you're in Slack, that there was another announcement beyond the paper that I just released. The conversation here is what to do if you're a manager and you're facing these problems. So I'm pleased to announce, and working with Tim, and working with Dean Parsons, that we are going to be releasing ICS 418, ICS Security Essentials for Managers. So if you are a part of any part of this conversation with management, if you're worried about how you talk about risk versus security, if you are starting off as a manager asked to step over, let's say you're IT security and you need to start doing OT security, we'll teach you the OT parts that you need as part of that course. Or if you're a practitioner and all of a sudden you're becoming a manager, we'll teach you that people have feelings beyond what RTUs will or will not do. And lastly, the continual education process that's always there, how to improve yourself over time by having sort of a continuing education. If you're a manager in place, we've got you covered too. That is going to go through beta process this year. We hope to be able to have students go through that, and look forward to being able to present on that later on with Dean and Tim.